Welcome, my friend, to another night where we let the past breathe and speak, not through the noise of modern cities, but through the slow turn of memory and the quiet weight of history. If you enjoy these deep journeys into forgotten worlds, make sure you leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, from where in the world are you listening tonight? Your corner of the map is part of this story too, for history touches every place in its own way. Now, settle in. Let us walk together through swinging doors that creak like old bones, into the dim light and heavy air of a saloon in the Wild West. Not the clean, romantic version polished by Hollywood, but the true one, thick with the smell of tobacco smoke, unwashed wool, and frying fat. It is evening in a small frontier town, perhaps in the Dakota Territory, perhaps in New Mexico, perhaps along the raw edges of Texas. The street outside is dust and shadow, the boards underfoot warped from years of boots striking them hard. You push through the saloon doors and step into a space that is both public and private, a place where miners, cowhands, gamblers, and the occasional lawman gather not just for drink, but for the one thing that makes the long days bearable: food. The food in a Wild West saloon was never simply an afterthought. It was survival disguised as comfort, sustenance wrapped in the aroma of grease and spice, a reminder that even in a place where bullets could settle arguments faster than words, a warm plate could buy you a few moments of peace. Yet this was not fine dining. The cook, often called simply Cookie, whether he had a name or not, worked with what could be found, what could be hunted, trapped, traded, or hauled in by rail or wagon. The menu changed with the seasons, with supply lines, with the weather. One night, the air might be thick with the scent of venison stew. The next, the only thing on offer might be beans cooked so long their skins had given up. The saloon was not merely a drinking hall, it was an anchor in a drifting town. The place where stories were traded alongside plates of food, where a stranger could walk in cold and hungry and walk out with a belly full of something hot, even if it was only bread and lard. You might imagine the tables crowded with steaks and whiskey, but the truth was leaner and harder. Beef, yes, but often the tougher cuts, the ones that needed hours over the fire to become edible. Pork when a hog could be slaughtered, rabbit, squirrel, even prairie dog in the poorer establishments. And always bread thick, rough bread, baked in iron Dutch ovens over open flames, its crust blackened and its center heavy with the taste of wood smoke. Alongside it, beans were the constant companion, simmered with salt pork if fortune smiled, with onions and a pinch of molasses if the cook had the means. And coffee strong, black, boiled until the grounds sank to the bottom of the pot. In the corner, a card game runs, the shuffling of the deck a counterpoint to the clink of tin plates. A miner leans over his beans, shoveling them in as though they might vanish if he ate too slowly. At the bar, a ranch hand orders a plate of biscuits and gravy, the gravy pale and thick, poured from a pot that has not been empty in days. In the kitchen, Cookie moves like a man used to both heat and danger, one hand on the skillet, the other on the knife, his eyes flicking to the back door where deliveries come in and trouble sometimes leaves. The smell is a mix of everything: onions caramelizing, bread cooling, fat rendering in the pan. Outside, the wind picks up, carrying dust into the seams of the doors. But inside the saloon, the air is dense and close, thick with the presence of men who have spent their day in the open and now seek the comfort of walls, food, and drink. You notice the plates are not uniform. Some are tin, dented and darkened. Others are mismatched china, likely brought west in a wagon years ago. Cutlery is scarce, so some eat with knives, others with spoons, and some with their hands, tearing bread and scooping stew with it. In a place like this, no one wastes time on manners. The code here is simple: eat while you can, drink while you can, and watch your back. The food tells the story of the town itself. Fresh vegetables are rare, maybe a few onions, carrots or potatoes if a farmer has brought them in, or if a shipment has survived the long, rough journey by train or stagecoach. In the spring, there might be wild greens, dandelion leaves, or shoots gathered from the hills. In summer, berries find their way into pies if sugar is available. In winter, meals lean heavily on dried goods and preserved meat. And then there are the more unusual offerings: turtle soup, if the river is generous; rattlesnake fried in cornmeal if a brave soul has caught one; and sometimes, in the far reaches, meat of uncertain origin that no one asks too many questions about. For many saloon, the midday meal was as important as the evening one, feeding workers before they returned to mining, herding, or other long hours of labor. Breakfast could be generous: cured meats, eggs when available, flapjacks topped with sweet syrup. The coffee pot was never empty, and a tin cup was always ready for whoever stepped inside. You might hear the shuffle of boots on the floorboards, the low hum of voices, and now and then a burst of laughter breaking the quiet. The food added its own rhythm: the sound of dough meeting a floured table, the sizzle of fat in a hot pan, the clink of spoons against bowls. This was the heart of the saloon, more than the bar itself, a place where hunger was met and people could feel, if only for a moment, the comfort of something handmade in a world that often felt harsh. The history of the Wild West Saloon is incomplete without its food. For in those plates and mugs lies the story of frontier life practicality, scarcity, and the satisfaction of a warm meal after a long day. Step into 10 saloons across the West, from Nevada mining towns to Texas cattle hubs, and you'd find 10 menus, each shaped by location, trade routes, and the skill of the cook. In Arizona territory, saloons drew on Mexican influences out of necessity. Tortillas replaced bread when yeast was scarce, beans were simmered with chilies, and strips of meat were dried into jerky for later stews. In the northern plains, where winters were long and game scarce, preserved foods dominated: salted meat, pickled vegetables, dried apples for pies, and root vegetables stored underground. In cattle country, beef ruled, though often it was the less prized cut slow-cooked brisket, broth from marrow bones, or liver fried to mask its strong flavor. Cooks were not trained chefs but resourceful workers, often former cowhands or miners. Kitchens were simple, with cast-iron stoves, Dutch ovens in coals, and coffee pots always on the heat. Supplies like flour, beans, and salt pork formed the base of every menu. When railroads came, new ingredients appeared: canned tomatoes, peaches, and condensed milk. But when shipments were late, saloons returned to basics. Bread making was daily work. Soda bread, biscuits, and skillet cornbread were all staples. Saloons often competed over their bread, as a memorable loaf could be as famous as their whiskey. Meat was cooked to bring out maximum flavor. Tough cuts became tender stews with onions and local herbs. Pork was smoked or salted, and chicken, though rare, was a special draw when fried or stewed with dumplings. Fish appeared only near rivers, lakes, or coasts: catfish, trout, or oysters in brine. Beans were ever present, cheap, filling, and always ready in a pot by the fire. In many saloons, anyone with a coin or something to trade could sit down to a bowl, a piece of bread, and a cup of coffee, making the meal as much a part of the saloon's identity as the drinks or the card games. Ould be flavored with molasses for sweetness, with chilies for heat, or with chunks of salt pork for richness. Some cooks swore by adding a splash of whiskey toward the end of cooking, claiming it deepened the flavor. Alongside beans, potatoes were the most versatile of ingredients, fried in strips for breakfast, boiled and mashed for supper, diced into stews, or baked in the coals until their skins split. Sweets were scarce but treasured. A pie, whether made from fresh fruit, dried apples, or even reconstituted prunes, was a luxury that could turn an ordinary meal into a celebration. Molasses cookies, sponge cake made with condensed milk, and fried dough dusted with sugar were occasional treats. Some saloons became known for a single dessert, and locals would swear no other place could match it. Drinks, of course, were the saloon's backbone. But even here, the lines between food and drink blurred. Coffee was served morning, noon, and night, strong enough to wake a man from a dead sleep, boiled until it was almost chewable, then poured into tin mugs that burned the hand if you weren't careful. Whiskey was not just for the bar, it went into sauces, marinades, and sometimes directly into the cook's mouth. Beer, often brewed on site in rudimentary conditions, could be used in bread dough, lending it a yeasty tang. In towns where the clientele included both locals and travelers, menus could take on a hybrid character. A prospector from the east might demand oysters or clam chowder if he had the coin, while a ranch hand from Mexico might ask for tamales. In some saloons, the owner took pride in offering both a sign not just of culinary ambition, but of adaptability in a land where survival favored those who could please as many as possible. And yet, no matter the variety, saloon food always carried a certain ruggedness. This was not the delicate plating of a city restaurant, nor the polite courses of an Eastern hotel. Plates were piled high and served fast, with the understanding that the man eating them might be gone tomorrow, either on the trail or in the ground. The food was sustenance first, comfort second, and spectacle only if the cook happened to have a flair for presentation. In the corner, you might see a gambler with a plate of steak and fried potatoes, cutting small, deliberate bites between shuffling his cards. At the bar, a cowboy might be wolfing down a stew so hot the steam fogged his eyes. Near the door, a drifter eats quietly, tearing bread and dipping it into gravy, eyes on the floor, ears on the room. The smell of the kitchen never fades. It seeps into the walls, the curtains, the very boards underfoot, so that even when the room is empty and the fire low, you can close your eyes and still smell onions, coffee, and the faint tang of whiskey. To eat in a Wild West saloon was to taste the land itself, its harshness, its generosity, its unpredictability. Every bite told you something about where you were and who had passed through before you. And for many, that taste was the closest thing to home they would ever know. To understand what it truly meant to eat in a Wild West saloon, you have to strip away the romantic haze of dime novels and picture it as it was loud, restless, and carrying the constant undertone that something might happen at any moment. The moment you stepped inside, the warmth from the stove hit you first, along with the scent of cooking that had been going on since dawn. That smell was never just one thing. It was a blend of boiling beans, frying meat, bread baking somewhere out of sight, and coffee that had been sitting on the stove long enough to turn almost black. Mixed into that were the smells of the people, sweat from the trail, leather from saddles and boots, tobacco smoke curling in from the bar area. There was a rhythm to how food was served, even if it didn't look like much of a system. The tables, rough and scarred from years of use, were scattered unevenly across the floor. Some near the bar where men could keep an eye on the action, others pushed toward the back for those who wanted to eat in relative quiet. In the corner, the stove radiated heat, and above it, hooks held cast iron pans, ladles, and battered pots blackened from years of service. The cook, often a man with forearms like hams and a cigarette clamped between his teeth, moved with surprising efficiency, ladling stew into tin bowls, slapping meat onto plates, barking at anyone who got in his way. If you were a regular, you might not even have to place your order. The cook already knew what you wanted and would slap it down with a nod. If you were a stranger, you learned fast to have your coin-ready food wasn't served on credit unless the owner trusted you, and trust was hard to earn. The noise was constant, the clink of cutlery against tin, the scrape of chairs, the mutter of conversations that rose and fell in waves, punctuated by bursts of laughter or the sharp slap of cards on a table. Somewhere, a piano might be playing, though often out of tune, the music carrying just enough to weave itself into the din. At the barkeep's voice cut through everything as he called orders to the cook or told someone their glass was empty. Eating here wasn't a private affair, you were part of a shared space, and that space had rules, even if no one had written them down. You didn't take another man's seat if his hat or coat was still there. You didn't complain about the food unless you were ready to take it up with the cook, and few were foolish enough to do that. You kept your eyes to yourself unless you were looking to start trouble, and if you were seated near the door, you didn't block the way too many needed to come and go quickly, sometimes in a hurry that didn't bode well. The food itself was served without ceremony, but with a certain pride. Plates were heavy, portions generous when supplies were good, meager when they weren't. Stew might be ladled over bread to soak up the juices, or meat laid alongside potatoes that had been mashed with their skins still on. Coffee came in thick mugs that could double as weapons, poured so hot it scalded the tongue if you weren't careful. If there was pie, it came last, often cut unevenly depending on how many had ordered it. Some ate quickly, shoveling food in as if they hadn't eaten in days. Others lingered, chewing slowly, savoring each bite, not out of politeness but because they had nowhere else to be. The atmosphere around the tables could shift in an instant. One moment, there might be quiet conversation. The next, the scrape of a chair and the heavy silence that followed as two men locked eyes over some slight, real or imagined. More than one fight had started over a spilled drink, a borrowed hat, or a careless word about someone's horse. The food might keep people alive, but it didn't soften tempers. And yet, there was also camaraderie here. Men who'd never met before might share a table out of necessity, and by the end of the meal be trading stories about trail drives or gold claims. Someone might slide their last biscuit toward a stranger whose plate was empty. A miner might offer a slice of pie to a saloon girl on her break, not as payment but as a rare gesture of kindness. The cook watched all this from his corner, part of the life of the place but separate, his hands busy, his ears catching every word. He knew who was likely to pay and who might try to skip out. He could spot a drifter who was trouble from the way they held their fork, and a ranch hand in from the range by the way they cradled their coffee. The act of eating here was as much about belonging as it was about food. If the barkeep knew your name and the cook nodded when you walked in, you were part of the fabric of the place. If no one spoke to you, you were an outsider, and in the West, that could be dangerous. And so every meal was layered with meaning, comfort for some, necessity for others, and for a few, a brief respite from whatever waited outside the swinging doors. To dine in a Wild West saloon was to take part in a ritual that mixed hunger, habit, and human nature, all under a roof where the air was thick with smoke and the floor never quite clean. And when you finished, you didn't linger unless you belonged. You stepped back out into the dust and sun, the sounds of the saloon fading behind you, replaced by the endless horizon. Before the first customer ever set foot in a Wild West saloon for the day, the work of feeding them had already begun hours earlier, often in the dim light before sunrise. The cook, sometimes the only one in the kitchen and sometimes with a single helper, moved through the cramped space behind the bar or in a lean-to kitchen at the back, stoking the fire in the big iron stove until it roared hot enough to warm the whole room. Supplies were pulled from wherever they had been stored: potatoes in burlap sacks, beans in heavy barrels, sides of beef or pork hanging from hooks, flour in large wooden bins, coffee beans in tins or paper sacks that had traveled miles by wagon. These supplies didn't just appear. They were the result of constant negotiation, barter, and sometimes outright luck. In towns near the railroad, goods might arrive regularly, but in isolated settlements, a snowstorm, swollen river, or bandit raid could mean no deliveries for weeks. That forced saloon owners to be resourceful, relying on what could be hunted, fished, grown locally, or preserved. Meat often came from ranches outside town, beef slaughtered and butchered nearby, pork from hogs raised by local farmers, venison from hunters who traded cuts for credit at the bar. Chickens were kept not just for eggs, but for roasting whole when the occasion called for it. Fresh vegetables were rare in winter, so cooks leaned heavily on root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and onions, which stored well in cool cellars, and on dried legumes like beans and lentils. Cabbage was a mainstay, easy to grow, hearty, and filling, often boiled down into stews or served alongside meat. The first sounds of the kitchen were steady and purposeful. The thud of a cleaver on the chopping block, the scrape of a knife peeling potatoes, the rattle of beans being poured into a pot to soak. Water had to be hauled in buckets unless the building had a pump, and every gallon was precious. Into the biggest kettles went the bones left over from previous roasts, covered with water and set to simmer into a rich broth that would form the base for the day's stew. This was how nothing went to waste. The broth carried the essence of yesterday's labor into today's meal. Frying pans were set over the hottest part of the stove, and the scent of sizzling bacon or salt pork soon filled the air, seeping into the wooden walls and mingling with the smell of coffee brewing. The coffee was ground by hand, often coarsely, and boiled directly in big pots, sometimes with eggshells tossed in to settle the grounds. It was strong, sometimes bitter, and served without cream unless the saloon had a steady dairy supply, which was rare. Bread was either baked fresh each morning or brought in from a local baker if the town was big enough to have one. In smaller settlements, biscuits or cornbread were more common, quick to make and able to be baked right in the cast iron pans on the stove. For the midday crowd, preparations began in earnest after the morning meal was cleared. Large cuts of meat were roasted slowly, turned by hand, and basted with their own juices. In some kitchens, an open hearth spit was still used, the cook tending it constantly to keep the meat from burning on one side. Stew pots bubbled steadily, each one containing a mixture of whatever was on hand. Chunks of beef or mutton, beans, onions, maybe a few precious carrots or pieces of cabbage, all seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of chili powder or dried herbs, if available. Flour and lard were combined to make gravies thick enough to cling to bread, and fried potatoes were a reliable filler, their edges crisp from the hot pan. The noise of cooking was as much a part of the saloon's daily soundtrack as the clink of glasses at the bar. Pans hissed, lids rattled, knives clattered against the cutting board. From time to time, the cook would bark at a helper to fetch more wood for the stove or to check the back room for another sack of beans. There was a certain pride in making a meal stretch far enough to feed every paying customer, and the best cooks could do it without anyone feeling shortchanged. Preservation was key in an era without refrigeration. Meats were salted or smoked, fish dried, fruits turned into preserves. In summer, wild berries might be gathered and baked into pies, but in winter, dessert was usually something like dried apple pie, the fruit soaked in water before baking to soften it. Butter, if there was any, was churned locally and kept cool in a cellar or spring house. Sometimes customers brought in game rabbits, prairie chickens, even wild turkey, which the cook would prepare in exchange for a drink or a meal. By late morning, the kitchen was a haze of steam and smoke, the heat oppressive, sweat running down the cook's neck and soaking his shirt. Yet everything had to be timed so that when the first rush came through the swinging doors, plates could be filled quickly and without fuss. The saloon was not a fine restaurant. There was no menu, no choice of sides. You ate what was cooking that day, and you ate it the way it was served. But there was a strange democracy in tea. Hat ranch hands, gamblers, drifters, and occasionally a visiting dignitary, all eating from the same pot, drinking the same coffee, breaking the same bread. And when the day's work in the kitchen was finally done and the last plate scraped clean, the cook might finally take his own seat, a mug of coffee in one hand, a plate of cooling stew in front of him, and listen to the ebb and flow of voices in the saloon, knowing that tomorrow it would all begin again, as it had for years, feeding the endless, hungry tide of the frontier. Season determined everything in a Wild West saloon's kitchen, shaping not just what could be served, but how it was prepared, how it smelled, how it looked on the plate, and how long it might last before spoiling. In spring, when the thaw broke winter's grip, the menu subtly shifted as soon as the first fresh supplies trickled into town. Wagons from nearby farms brought tender greens like young lettuce and spinach, sometimes wild ramps or fiddlehead ferns gathered along creek banks, all of which seemed like luxuries after months of root vegetables and dried beans. Chickens laid more eggs with the lengthening days, and those eggs found their way into hearty breakfasts, custards, or the occasional sponge cake for the saloon's more favored patrons. Fresh milk might be available again, briefly, before the heat of summer made it too risky to store without spoilage. The cook would often rise before dawn to meet those wagons, striking quick deals to secure the best produce before anyone else could claim it. Summer brought both abundance and peril. Gardens flourished, producing tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, and peppers, and the smell of fresh herbs like basil and parsley might drift from a kitchen's open window. Fruits were plentiful: peaches, plums, cherries baked into pies that vanished as fast as they cooled. But summer's heat was an enemy. Meat spoiled faster, flies swarmed the kitchen, and ice was a rare and expensive commodity hauled in from distant sources or cut in winter and stored under sawdust in icehouses. That meant meals had to be prepared and served quickly, with salted or smoked meats taking precedence over fresh cuts unless the cook was confident they'd sell out before turning bad. The hum of activity in a summer saloon kitchen was constant. Jars of fruit preserved in sugar syrup, vegetables pickled in brine, hams hanging in the smokehouse to absorb flavor and protection from decay. Then came autumn, the season of harvest, when the kitchen felt almost decadent in its choices. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and squash piled high. Sacks of grain delivered for bread and biscuits, and barrels of apples for pies or cider. Hunters returned with deer, elk, or antelope, and the smell of roasting game would lure even those who hadn't planned to eat. Autumn was also the time for saloon owners to stock up for the hard months ahead, filling shelves with jars of preserved fruits, dried beans, salted fish, and cured meats. In some towns, barrels of sauerkraut were made and stored in the cool cellar to be ladled out through winter. With winter came a shift back to the bare essentials, and in many saloons, the meals felt heavier, more filling, meant to sustain laborers against the cold. The kitchen leaned on the stores built up in autumn: stews thick with beans and salted pork, cornbread baked fresh each day, dried apples rehydrated for pie. The stove was kept burning not just for cooking, but for warmth, making the kitchen a refuge from the biting wind outside. Occasionally, if the saloon was near a frozen river, the cook might chop through the ice to catch fish, or barter with trappers for fresh meat. But more often, the winter table was a repetition of the same reliable dishes. These seasonal rhythms weren't just practical, they became part of the saloon's identity, something the regulars came to expect. A ranch hand might remember the tangy pickles of summer or the rich venison stew of autumn, and plan his trips into town accordingly. And in frontier towns where news traveled slowly and entertainment was scarce, the arrival of a certain dish could spark conversation across the bar. "They've got fresh peach pie at O'Malley's," someone might say, and before long, half the room would be heading in that direction. Regional differences added another layer to the seasonal shifts. In Texas saloons, chili was a staple: meat, beans, and peppers cooked long and slow, often with enough heat to make a man sweat even in winter. In mining towns with large immigrant populations, the menu might feature dishes brought from the old country: Cornish pasties filled with meat and potatoes, German sausages served with sauerkraut, Italian-style bread baked crusty and dark. Near the coasts, seafood sometimes appeared: oysters shipped in barrels of brine, clams steamed and served with bread. In the desert territories, cooks leaned on hearty foods like mesquite grilled meat, cactus pads sautéed with onions, or beans cooked with smoked chili peppers. Even the drinks reflected the seasons. In summer, whiskey might be served with a splash of cool well water, beer drawn from a keg kept in the shadiest part of the cellar. In winter, coffee flowed in endless pots, sometimes fortified with a shot of brandy or rum. Mulled drinks made with spices, citrus peel, and sugar were a welcome indulgence when the snow piled high outside. Through it all, the saloon kitchen was a place of constant adaptation. Its daily work shaped by the weather, the supply chain, the skills of the cook, and the appetites of the patrons. A traveler passing through might never notice the subtle ways the food changed from one season to the next, but for the regulars, cowboys, miners, traders, the meals were a kind of calendar, marking the slow turning of the year not by dates, but by flavors, aromas, and the comfort of a familiar dish served just when it was needed most. And so, while the saloon might be remembered for its whiskey and card games, those who truly knew the place could recall just as vividly the taste of its bread in spring, the smell of its pies in summer, the steam of its stews in autumn, and the weight of its hearty fare in the cold, dark heart of winter. The dining room of a Wild West saloon was never just a place to eat. It was a living stage where the smells of the kitchen mingled with the clink of cutlery, the scrape of chairs, and the low murmur of voices carrying stories from miles around. The air was thick with the scent of coffee brewing in great blackened pots, of meat roasting over an open flame, of bread just pulled from the oven, mingling with the faint sharpness of pickles brined in barrels out back. The long wooden tables, often scarred with knife marks and stained from years of use, were set with mismatched plates, tin cups and utensils whose handles had been worn smooth by countless hands. Lanterns or oil lamps hung from hooks on the walls, their flickering light casting warm pools across the rough plank floors, while in the corner, a pot-bellied stove hissed and popped, sending out waves of heat that made the chill of the frontier night seem far away. Patrons entered from the dusty street outside, brushing off coats, stamping boots, and making their way to a seat with the kind of unspoken awareness of territory that regulars always had. This table was known for the ranch hands, that one for the card players, and the small table by the window often kept free for the traveling salesman or the quiet stranger. The saloon girls, who by day might serve drinks or sing, carried trays laden with steaming bowls of stew, thick slices of bread, plates of beans and ham, the food arriving in a constant rhythm that matched the steady pace of conversation. You could tell who had been working the hardest by the way they ate. Miners hunched over their plates, shoveling food as if to make up for lost time. Cowboys taking slower bites, pausing to sip coffee and glance toward the card tables. Merchants talking through their meals, discussing prices of goods, and shipments due in on the next stagecoach. The unwritten rules of the room were clear to those who belonged. No man reached for food before others at his table had been served. If a stranger joined a table uninvited, his manner and words would be measured carefully before he was accepted into the flow of talk. And if tempers flared over a game, a woman, or a careless remark, it was often the cook or the head waitress who could diffuse the moment with a sharp word or the promise of another round of coffee. The soundscape was constant. Spoons tapping bowls, knives cutting into meat, the squeak of the swinging doors as someone came in from the bar, a burst of laughter from the far corner when someone told a well-worn joke. From the kitchen came the thud of a cleaver striking bone, the rattle of pans, the hiss of fat hitting a hot skillet. Outside, the wind might howl or the rain drum against the roof, but inside the saloon dining room, the steady beat of mealtime was its own kind of shelter. Children were rare in these rooms, but not unknown. Occasionally a traveling family would sit in the corner, the little ones wide-eyed at the sight of so many rough men eating together, and more than one cowboy, softened by the memory of his own family, would quietly pass them a piece of candy or a leftover biscuit. Travelers often spoke of the surprising warmth of these meals. Not the physical warmth of the stove, but the social warmth of being part of a crowd, sharing food in a place where life was hard and tomorrow uncertain. Meals were not rushed unless necessity demanded it. A man might linger over his coffee for an hour, listening to news from other towns or the latest talk of cattle prices, while others refilled his cup without needing to be asked. And yet, there was an unspoken efficiency to the service. Dishes appeared and vanished without fuss, the staff weaving between tables with the ease of long practice. The PLS-8s themselves told stories, some chipped and mended, others clearly bought from the last shipment off the rail, and once in a while, a fine porcelain plate that had somehow made the journey west, looking almost out of place under a slab of fried beef. As the evening wore on, the line between the dining room and the bar began to blur. Men would carry plates to the card tables, or women serving drinks might pause to share a bite with a friend. The smells grew richer as more food was served, layered now with the sharper notes of whiskey and tobacco. Outside, the street might be empty, but inside, the saloon felt like the center of the world, a place where news, food, and companionship came together in equal measure. When the last plates were cleared and the oil lamps began to burn low, the dining room settled into a quieter rhythm. The few remaining patrons sipping the dregs of their drinks, voices softer now, the kitchen winding down with the final scrape of pans and the soft thud of the back door closing for the night. And as the staff swept the floors, wiped the tables, and banked the stove, they knew that tomorrow the cycle would begin again, new faces, new stories. The same familiar meals that tied the life of the town together in ways no ledger or law could measure. In that room, under that roof, food was more than sustenance, it was a ritual, a reassurance, and for many, the one true constant in the shifting, uncertain world of the Wild West. In the saloons of the Wild West, certain dishes achieved a kind of legendary status, spoken of in the same breath as the fastest guns or the wildest poker hands. They weren't fancy meals. By any city standard, most were humble in origin, born from necessity, from whatever could be gathered, hunted, or traded, but they carried a weight of tradition and expectation. One such dish was the beef stew, a cornerstone of frontier cooking. It began early in the morning, when the cook, sometimes an old prospector too worn for mining, sometimes a woman who had traveled west with her husband and found herself widowed but determined to make a living, would set a heavy cast-iron pot over the stove. Into it went whatever cuts of beef were cheapest or toughest, cubes of meat that would soften only after hours of slow simmering. Carrots, potatoes, onions, and occasionally turnips joined the pot, along with a handful of dried herbs if they could be spared. The stew would bubble all day, the smell drawing in patrons long before they saw the inside of the saloon. By evening, it was thick, rich, and hearty enough to satisfy a man who had spent 12 hours in the saddle. It wasn't just a meal. It was a kind of glue holding together the varied lives that passed through those doors. Another staple was beans, served in countless variations. Some saloons used navy beans, others pintos, but all shared the method: slow cooking with salt pork, molasses, or sometimes just a pinch of sugar and a splash of vinegar for tang. Beans could sit on the stove for hours without spoiling, ready to be ladled out at any moment, which made them perfect for the unpredictable flow of customers. Cowboys swore by them for the energy they gave, though the after effects were a source of endless humor around the campfire. Then there were biscuits, soft, fluffy, and best eaten warm, slathered with butter or drizzled with honey if the saloon had managed to get some from a passing trader. Biscuits were a matter of pride for a good cook. A well-made biscuit could turn a plain meal into something memorable, while a poorly made one, hard, dry, and crumbling, would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. In some towns, travelers would choose their saloon based on who was baking that day. Meat pies were rarer but treasured when they appeared. Filled with chopped beef or venison, thickened with gravy, and wrapped in a crust that might be flaky if the cook had lard or dense and chewy if they didn't. These pies were portable meals for men heading back on the trail. Stories went that one gambler in Deadwood would always buy one to eat, one to carry in his coat pocket as insurance against bad luck at the tables. Not all saloon food was heavy and hot. In mining towns where summers turned the air to dust and the heat to an oppressive blanket, cold plates became a welcome offering. Slices of cured ham, wedges of cheese, pickled eggs pulled from large glass jars, and rough hunks of bread made a meal that didn't need a stove. These cold spreads often became the stage for negotiations. Railwaymen and cattle barons alike preferred to talk business over a plate that could be picked at without distraction. And then there were the special occasion meals. When a herd had been successfully driven in, or when a new railroad spur was completed, the saloon might splurge on a menu that included roast beef with gravy, fried chicken, or even oysters shipped in barrels of brine from the coast. Such nights were loud, jubilant affairs, with every table full and the kitchen running hotter than the poker games. One tale tells of a small-town saloon that advertised oyster night so successfully that it drew people from 50 miles away only for the oysters to spoil on the journey. The cook, quick-witted and unwilling to lose face, breaded and fried chunks of beef in the same batter and served them with lemon wedges in place of the shellfish. No one complained, and the dish became a local specialty known as prairie oysters, though they bore little resemblance to anything from the sea. Every dish had a story, and those stories were passed from patron to patron, as much a part of the saloon's character as its decor or its regulars. A man might brag that he once ate 6 bowls of stew in a single sitting, or that he was there the night the cook accidentally seasoned the biscuits with sugar instead of salt, making them the sweetest bread anyone had ever tasted in that dusty little town. The cooks themselves became figures of note, sometimes feared, sometimes adored. They guarded their recipes closely, measuring spices by instinct, never by spoon, and adjusting the flavor based on what they knew their customers wanted that night. A quiet evening might call for a stew richer and thicker, while a rowdy payday crowd might prefer food that came quick and plentiful. And though saloon food was often dismissed by outsiders as crude, those who ate it regularly knew its value. It wasn't about refinement, it was about resilience. The meals told of a land where supplies could vanish with one missed shipment, where a cook might have to turn squirrel meat into something edible, where the arrival of a bag of flour could mean biscuits for weeks. These dishes were survival dressed as comfort, proof that even in the roughest places, people would find a way to make something worth sitting down for. The Wild West saloon table was where hunger met ingenuity, where the flavors of many cultures, Mexican spices, German baking, English stews, and Native American preservation techniques blended into something uniquely Western. And for the men and women who crowded those tables night after night, it was the taste of home, even if home was 1,000 miles away. There were certain nights in the Wild West when the menu in a saloon shifted from the predictable comfort of beef stew and beans to something unexpected, something whispered about for days after. These rare offerings didn't follow any set schedule. They appeared when chance allowed, when a shipment came through against all odds, or when a hunter returned with an unusual catch. One such delicacy was fresh fish. In towns hundreds of miles from the nearest river capable of sustaining anything bigger than a minnow, the arrival of trout, catfish, or even salmon was cause for celebration. Sometimes the fish came packed in barrels of ice from far-off mountain streams, brought in by traders who knew they could command a small fortune for the novelty. The cook would prepare it simply pan-fried in butter if there was any, or dusted with cornmeal and cooked over an open flame because the flavor itself was the attraction. Patrons would sit in near reverent silence as they ate, savoring each bite, knowing they might not taste fish again for months, perhaps years. Then there was game meat. Venison was not unheard of, but elk, moose, or even bear would turn an ordinary night into something extraordinary. A hunter might stride into the saloon, a pelt slung over one shoulder, the promise of fresh meat on his lips. The cook would work quickly, cutting steaks, roasting large joints over the fire, and serving them with whatever sides were on hand. Bear meat, in particular, was a conversation starter. Its rich, slightly sweet taste was unlike beef, and opinions about it varied wildly. Some swore it was the best meat they'd ever eaten. Others compared it unfavorably to tough old mutton. Exotic imports occasionally made their way west, though rarely without mishap. A shipment of tropical fruit, bananas, pineapples, oranges might survive the long journey from the coast if the weather was kind and the cargo hold dry. On those rare evenings, the saloon would seem almost enchanted, its rough wooden tables adorned with bowls of fruit that looked like treasures from another world. Men who had never seen a pineapple before would circle it cautiously before taking a slice, laughing at the odd, sweet tang on their tongues. A few might joke that it tasted like something meant for a queen, not a cowboy. Spices, too, could transform a meal into something memorable. A trader from the east might bring cinnamon, cloves, or peppercorns, selling them by the ounce to saloon keepers eager to impress. A dash of cinnamon in a pot of beans or a pinch of pepper over a steak could elevate the dish into something remarkable. Patrons might not know the name of the spice, but they'd remember the meal forever, describing it later with exaggerated gestures and wide-eyed conviction. Sometimes the rarest dishes came not from trade, but from ingenuity and daring. There are stories of cooks who, faced with an unexpected ingredient, turned it into a signature dish. One saloon in Arizona became famous for its rattlesnake stew, served with biscuits and a stiff drink to steady the nerves of anyone trying it for the first time. The meat, once skinned and deboned, was said to be tender and surprisingly mild, absorbing the flavors of the broth like any other protein. For weeks after, patrons would challenge newcomers to try it, slapping them on the back when they finished a bowl without grimacing. Occasionally, a saloon would play host to a guest cook someone traveling through, perhaps a chef who had once worked in a hotel back east, or a woman carrying her family's recipes from Mexico or China. These nights were a revelation, introducing flavors the locals had never imagined. In mining towns, Chinese cooks sometimes prepared stir-fried vegetables with soy sauce, a taste so foreign and yet so addictive that it became a sought-after treat. In cattle towns, Mexican influences brought tamales wrapped in corn husks, spicy chili stews, and tortillas fresh from the griddle. The impact of these rare meals was more than just culinary, it was cultural. For a few hours, the saloon became a place where the hard lines between cowboys, miners, traders, and travelers blurred, where everyone was united by the simple joy of tasting something new. These dishes became legends not because they were the best anyone had ever eaten, but because they were unexpected, almost magical in their appearance. They reminded the people of the frontier that the world was larger than the stretch of land they called home, that there were flavors and textures beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered. And long after the plates were cleared, the memory of those meals lingered, as vivid as the smell of coffee in the morning or the sound of boots on the saloon's wooden floor. They became stories, told again and again, growing richer with each retelling until they were woven into the very fabric of the Wild West. For the men and women who lived there, these rare nights of extraordinary food were more than just a break from the ordinary. They were proof that even in the harshest, most remote corners of the world, there could be moments of pure wonder. In the Wild West, food had a way of becoming more than just sustenance. It became a story, a memory, a piece of local lore that could outlive the people who first tasted it. When a saloon managed to serve something truly out of the ordinary, the experience didn't end when the last bite was eaten. Instead, it echoed through conversations in the streets, around campfires, and in the bunkhouses where cowhands lay staring at the rafters, recalling every detail. Men spoke of the rattlesnake stew as if it were a rite of passage, exaggerating the size of the snake, the fierceness of the catch, the heat of the spices. A bear roast might be remembered less for its taste than for the story of the hunter who brought it in, perhaps a quiet man who walked 100 miles through snow with the carcass dragging behind him, or a brash youngster who bragged until he nearly choked on his first bite. In a world where each day could bring hardship or danger, these shared meals became anchors in the minds of those who experienced them. A miner might work months underground, saving his gold dust for a night when he could afford not just a drink, but a plate of something he'd been hearing about for weeks. That first taste would be imprinted in his mind, tied forever to the faces, the laughter, and the creak of the saloon door as the night wore on. The stories would take on a life of their own. A simple venison pie might be remembered as the Great Game Feast of '74, when the town's best marksman returned from a hunting trip with so much meat that the saloon kept serving for 3 days straight, charging nothing for the second plate. A shipment of pineapples might become the tale of the Night of the Golden Fruit, when cowboys competed to see who could eat the most without wincing at the strange sweetness. Even ordinary dishes could be transformed by the drama surrounding them. A pot of chili might gain legendary status if it was served the night a notorious outlaw was captured, or if it was the last meal a beloved sheriff ate before heading into a gunfight. People would swear the flavor was never the same afterward, that the cook had changed something in the recipe out of grief or superstition. Saloon owners understood the power of these stories, and the shrewdest among them cultivated them like crops. They might exaggerate the rareity of an ingredient, hinting that it could be months before such a treat came again. They might tell newcomers that the recipe was a secret passed down from a grandmother in a distant country, or claim that a certain spice could only be bought from a trader who came through once a year. Patrons would believe it, or at least they'd want to. The truth was less important than the feeling. The atmosphere during these meals was unlike any other. Men who normally kept to themselves would lean across tables to swap stories, their voices low but animated. Laughter rang louder, drinks were poured more generously, and even the music from the corner piano seemed livelier. For a few hours, the saloon wasn't just a place to eat and drink, it was the center of the universe, a place where something extraordinary was happening. And because such nights were rare, they burned brighter in memory. Long after the saloon was gone, its wooden walls collapsed, its sign faded to nothing in the desert sun, the stories would remain. Old-timers sitting outside the general store would tell wide-eyed children about that night, their voices dropping for dramatic effect. They described the smell of roasting meat drifting out into the street, the way the tables groaned under the weight of food, the hush that fell when the first plates were served. The children, in turn, would grow up imagining those nights as if they'd lived them, passing the tales along until no one could quite remember where truth ended and legend began. In this way, the food of the Wild West became part of its mythology. It was never just about the taste, it was about the rarity, the risk, the sense of community that came when people gathered around a table to share something special. It was about knowing that in a hard, unpredictable world, there could still be moments that felt almost magical. The dishes that became legends were not always the most elaborate or expensive. Sometimes it was a humble stew, made with whatever was on hand, but served on a night when the stars aligned, when the right people were in the room, the right music played, and the right story began to take shape. Other times, it was something exotic, a dish no one expected to find so far from the cities and coasts, served to a room full of people who would talk about it for the rest of their lives. The Wild West has been gone for more than a century, but its saloon legends endure. They live on in dusty diaries, in old cookbooks filled with grease stains and handwritten notes, in faded photographs showing tables piled high with food. They live on in the romanticized tales told in books and movies, where a meal is as much a turning point as a gunfight. And they live on in the imagination, where the scent of roasting meat still drifts from a swinging saloon door, and the promise of something rare and unforgettable waits just beyond the threshold. In the everyday rhythm of the Wild West, saloons were not always scenes of lavish feasts and legendary delicacies. More often, they were practical places where hungry men came in from the trail, the mines, or the rail yards, looking for something to fill their stomachs and keep them moving. The daily menu of a typical saloon reflected the reality of frontier life: limited resources, unpredictable supply lines, and the ingenuity of cooks who could make something satisfying out of whatever was on hand. For the working cowboy, miner, or laborer, breakfast was often the most important and substantial meal of the day, especially if his work began before sunrise. A plate of beans, slow-cooked with pork or salt fatback until the flavor seeped into every bite, might be the most common offering. Thick slabs of bread, sometimes homemade and sometimes from a nearby bakery if the town had one, would be served alongside, toasted on the griddle and dripping with butter or lard. Coffee was a given strong, black, and often brewed in a large pot that sat on the stove all day, its flavor growing harsher with each hour it simmered. Those with a few more coins to spare might add eggs to their breakfast, fried quickly in cast iron with bacon or ham, the sizzling fat giving the whole room a savory scent. In regions where cattle ranching was dominant, beef was a regular feature on the menu, though it was rarely the tender cuts we imagine today. A lunch plate might include thick slices of brisket or shoulder, cooked low and slow until the meat could be pulled apart with a fork, often served with whatever vegetables were in season: cabbage, carrots, or potatoes being the most reliable. In mining towns, where supply trains might be delayed for weeks, vegetables were often replaced with pickled goods, cucumbers, beets, or even pickled eggs sitting in large jars on the counter. These were not luxuries but necessities, as they kept through long winters when fresh produce was scarce. The midday crowd in a saloon was a different mix from the evening. Cowboys between drives, miners between shifts, tradesmen on a short break. They didn't have time for lingering meals, so dishes were simple, filling, and quick to prepare. A common lunch special might be a bowl of chili rich, with chunks of beef, beans, onions, and a generous hand with the spices, or a meat pie, baked that morning and served in thick wedges. Cornbread was another staple, baked in cast-iron pans and served warm, often with molasses or honey if available. Dinner in a saloon varied depending on the day's events and what the cook had to work with. If a shipment had just arrived from a larger city, the menu might include fresh fish, oysters shipped in barrels of ice, or fine cheeses. More often, it was stew meat, potatoes, and whatever vegetables could be spared, served in deep bowls with bread on the side. The cook's skill lay in making the familiar taste just a little different each night, adding herbs, changing the spice blend, or stretching the meat with more root vegetables when supplies ran low. For those who had worked long hours and wanted more than a quick bite, some saloons offered the full plate, a combination of meat, potatoes, beans, and bread, meant to keep a man full until morning. Drinks were always part of the experience, and even with a modest meal, a customer might order beer, whiskey, or coffee to wash it down. Saloons also knew the value of cheap, salty snacks, roasted peanuts, salted pork cracklings, or hard cheese items that encouraged patrons to linger and order more drinks. Seasonality played a big role in the saloon menu. In spring, wild greens like dandelion leaves or watercress might appear, along with the first radishes and young onions from local gardens. Summer brought tomatoes, corn, and berries, while fall was the time for hearty squash, pumpkins, and apples. Winter menus were the most repetitive, relying on preserved goods, dried beans, and salted meats. This cycle was familiar to everyone who lived in the West, and it made certain dishes deeply tied to certain times of year. A fresh berry pie in midsummer was as much a cause for celebration as the first snowfall in winter. The cooks in these saloons were not always trained chefs. Many were former trail cooks, women supporting families, or immigrants bringing their own culinary traditions into the mix. In towns with a strong immigrant presence, the menu might feature German sausages, Italian pasta dishes, or Chinese stir-fries alongside the standard Western fare. This blending of flavors was one of the quiet, unnoticed ways the West became a melting pot long before the term was popularized. For the regulars, the daily menu was as comforting as it was predictable. A cowboy might ride into town knowing exactly what he'd order and where he'd sit, greeted by the familiar smell of frying onions and baking bread. The same tin plates, the same sturdy mugs, the same gruff but friendly voice of the saloon keeper. It all added up to a sense of home, even for men who didn't have one in the conventional sense. These everyday meals lacked the drama of the rare feasts and exotic dishes, but they were the foundation on which those legends were built. Without the steady rhythm of beans, bread, stew, and coffee, the extraordinary nights would have had nothing to stand out against. And for the men and women who built their lives in the hard, unpredictable world of the frontier, that steady rhythm was worth more than gold dust or poker winnings. It was the assurance that no matter how rough the trail had been, or how dangerous the work, there would always be a plate waiting, a place to sit, and a meal that tasted like the West itself, simple, hearty, and made to last. The menu of a saloon in the Wild West was never a static thing, because the West itself was not a uniform land. It stretched across deserts, prairies, mountain ranges, and fertile valleys, each with its own resources, climate, and cultural influences. A man riding from Texas to California could stop at a dozen different saloons and never eat the same meal twice. Not because the cooks were chasing novelty, but because the land itself dictated what could be served. In Texas, especially in the southern and western reaches, beef reigned supreme. Cattle drives brought an abundance of meat, and the proximity to Mexico meant that many saloon kitchens leaned heavily into chili, spicy stews, and dishes seasoned with cumin, oregano, and chili powder. Beans were almost always pinto, slow-cooked until tender, and tortillas might appear alongside cornbread, a reflection of the blending of Anglo and Mexican traditions. Salsa made from fresh tomatoes, onions, and peppers would brighten plates, though in the colder months it was replaced by sauces made from dried chiles, giving a deep, smoky heat. Moving westward into New Mexico and Arizona, the desert climate shaped the food in other ways. Fresh produce was rare except during short harvest windows, so dried goods, beans, cornmeal, jerky formed the backbone of most meals. Here, the influence of Native American cooking joined with Mexican and frontier traditions. Fry bread was a common sight in saloons, served hot and topped with honey or used to scoop up hearty stews. In mining towns of Arizona Territory, the menu might even feature mesquite grilled meats, the smoky flavor as much a part of the meal as the food itself. California saloons were another story altogether, especially those near San Francisco or in the gold rush towns of the Sierra Nevada. The proximity to the Pacific Ocean meant fish and seafood were more common here than anywhere else in the West. Fresh oysters could be found in the most unexpected places, shipped inland in barrels packed with ice or salt water. Dungeness crab, halibut, and salmon appeared on menus during their seasons, often prepared simply to let the freshness speak for itself. The influence of Chinese immigrants who had come to work on the railroads and in the goldfields could also be seen. Noodles, stir-fried vegetables, and soy-based sauces sometimes appeared alongside traditional American fare. In Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, the challenges of cold winters and long supply lines meant saloon menus were dominated by preserved foods for much of the year. Salt pork, smoked sausages, and dried beans were staples, while root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips provided what little freshness could be stored through the winter. In cattle country, beef was common, but in the northern plains, buffalo still made an occasional appearance on the plate, roasted or stewed, a reminder of the days before the herds had been nearly wiped out. Venison, elk, and other game were also served, especially in more remote settlements where hunting supplemented what came in by wagon or train. Colorado's mining towns developed a reputation for hearty, stick-to-your-ribs fare. The high altitude meant cooler temperatures, which helped keep certain perishables longer but also made baking more challenging. Cooks adapted with denser breads and biscuits, and soups and stews thick enough to be eaten with a fork. Meat pies, often filled with beef, mutton, or whatever game was available, were favorites in these towns. The influence of Cornish miners brought pasties, folded pastry, filled with meat and vegetables, baked until golden, which could be carried into the mines and eaten without utensils. In the Pacific Northwest, saloons served a mix of land and sea. Salmon, trout, and clams joined venison, bear, and wild mushrooms on the menu. The region's temperate climate allowed for a greater variety of vegetables, and berries like huckleberries and blackberries often found their way into pies and jams. Coffee was particularly prized here, with some saloons boasting of beans shipped directly from San Francisco or even Hawaii. In the Great Basin regions of Nevada and Utah, menus often reflected scarcity. The arid climate limited agriculture, so mutton from sheep herds and preserved goods like dried beans, flour, and canned peaches formed much of the diet. In Mormon settlements, saloon fare was sometimes influenced by the broader community's cooking simple, nourishing, and often served without the heavy drinking that characterized saloons elsewhere. Across all these regions, one of the defining features of a saloon's menu was adaptability. A cook might have a plan for the week's meals, but if a supply wagon was delayed, a storm made deliveries impossible, or a shipment spoiled en route, the menu would change overnight. This was not a matter of creativity so much as survival. In many places, customers understood that the special of the day was often just what we managed to get today. Still, these regional differences gave the West a patchwork of flavors, each tied to the land and its people. A cowboy might remember the spicy chili of a Texas saloon for years after moving north, just as a miner might long for the seafood stew he'd tasted once in a San Francisco waterfront bar. The meals were not just sustenance, They were memories, markers of where a man had been, and reminders of the journey still ahead. In this way, the geography of the West left its mark on the stomach as much as on the landscape, shaping not just the menus, but the very culture of saloon dining. In the Wild West, a saloon was never just a place to get a drink or a meal. It was the beating heart of the community, the crossroads where business, pleasure, and sometimes violence intertwined. The aroma of cooking food mingled with the scent of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and the faint tang of sweat and leather from riders just in off the trail. Meals were served on heavy wooden tables scarred by years of knife cuts, spilled drinks, and the occasional bullet hole, each mark telling a story known to the old-timers and guessed at by newcomers. Food in a saloon was more than sustenance. It was a backdrop for human drama. A bowl of chili could be the opening to a business negotiation, a plate of steak and beans the silent offering to mend a fractured friendship. Men came in dusty and tired from weeks on the trail, and over a hot meal they'd loosen their tongues, telling stories of cattle drives, mining strikes, or distant towns they'd passed through. A good cook knew that filling bellies kept tempers from flaring most of the time. But the saloon was also a theater where appetites for food, drink, and risk blended into one. Poker tables were set near the dining area, so a man could keep a hand in the game while chewing a mouthful of cornbread. A winning streak might lead him to order oysters and champagne if the saloon was fancy enough to have them, while a losing streak could end with him pawning his revolver for another shot of whiskey and a simple plate of stew. In some places, a man's meal was part of his payment for services rendered. Ranch hands might earn a drink and supper for helping wrangle a stray steer. Drifters would trade a few hours of labor hauling barrels, chopping firewood for a seat at the long communal table, and whatever was ladled from the pot that night. And yet, for all the warmth of shared food, tensions simmered under the surface. A disagreement over a card game could start with sharp words over dessert and end with the scrape of chairs, the thud of boots on floorboards, and the metallic click of a hammer being pulled back on a revolver. Sometimes it was the food itself that sparked trouble. A plate sent back to the kitchen might insult the cook, especially if he was also the owner, leading to a shouting match that drew in bystanders. In mining towns where gold dust was the currency of choice, disputes over whether a meal was weighed and paid for fairly could escalate quickly. On quieter nights, the saloon's dining area transformed into a place of courtship. Men cleaned up as best they could, ordering a better cut of meat or a slice of pie to impress a lady, whether she was a local girl or one of the dance hall women employed by the saloon. Sharing a meal could be the first step toward a romance or a rivalry if another suitor was watching from across the room. News traveled by word of mouth, and the dinner table was the press room of the frontier. A traveler passing through might share the latest about a railroad being built, a notorious outlaw sighted nearby, or a change in land laws that could alter the fortunes of everyone in town. These conversations often unfolded between bites, with forks paused in midair as listeners absorbed the news. In some saloons, the owner made a point of hosting communal meals on Sundays or holidays, offering roast beef, fresh bread, and perhaps even apple pie. These events drew in families and created a rare space where gamblers, cowboys, merchants, and even the local sheriff might all sit within arm's reach. For a few hours, the saloon became a unifying force, its food serving as common ground. Yet the undercurrent of the West's unpredictability was always present. A stranger at the bar might be a harmless prospector or a bounty hunter tracking someone at one of the tables. A laugh shared over a meal could turn into a deadly misunderstanding after a few drinks. Food could build bridges, but in the wrong moment, it could also be the tinder that lit a fuse. The more successful saloons understood this dual nature. They invested in good meals, not just to feed the body, but to set a tone. A well-fed customer stayed longer, drank more, and often spent more money at the gaming tables. He was also less likely to start trouble, though, in the West. Less likely was never the same as unlikely. And so, as plates were cleared and mugs refilled, the saloon's rhythm continued. Deals made over steaks, alliances formed over stew, rivalries ignited over whiskey, and somewhere in the background, the steady, comforting clatter of a cook at work in the kitchen, keeping the heart of the saloon beating. It was in those moments halfway between hunger and satisfaction that the Wild West showed itself most clearly, rough, unpredictable, and held together by the fragile but enduring ritual of breaking bread together. When the iron rails finally began to snake their way across the vast expanse of the American frontier, the Wild West began to change in ways that were as subtle as they were profound, and nowhere was this transformation more visible or more tangible than in the saloons. Before the railroads, food in these establishments was dictated almost entirely by the whims of geography and the limitations of preservation. Meat was often what could be hunted or slaughtered nearby. Vegetables were those hardy enough to be grown in rough soil, or those that could survive weeks in a wagon without rotting onions, potatoes, beans. Bread, when served, was frequently dense, hard, and sometimes tinged with the faint taste of whatever flour substitute had been used in the leaner months. But the railroads changed the game. Suddenly, saloon owners had access to a world of goods that once seemed impossibly distant. Fresh produce could arrive from hundreds of miles away in a matter of days instead of weeks. Oysters from the East Coast, once a rare and expensive delicacy, could be served in Kansas, Montana, and even dusty Arizona towns. Canned goods, shipped in bulk, began to appear more frequently on menus. Peaches from Georgia, tomatoes from California, condensed milk from New York. It wasn't just the variety of food that changed, it was the way people ate. The arrival of rail deliveries allowed saloon keepers to offer more consistent menus. A man could walk into a saloon in Wyoming in December and find lettuce in his salad not wilted and tired from travel, but crisp and fresh from a refrigerated rail car. For the first time, the idea of seasonal eating began to blur, and in its place was a sense that the saloon could be a portal to a broader world. This influx of goods also brought a shift in cooking methods. Before the railroads, saloon cooks worked with heavy cast-iron pans over open flames, relying on smoke and salt to make food flavorful and preserve it for longer periods. With more reliable supplies, cooks could experiment with lighter flavors, fresher herbs, and ingredients that didn't have to be masked by heavy spices. Lemon slices began to appear alongside fish dishes. Parsley, basil, and thyme could be ordered from distant markets and used to garnish or flavor soups and roasts. Patrons noticed, for cowboys and miners accustomed to a diet of monotonous stews and bread, these new tastes were revelatory. A bite of fresh fruit or a sip of imported coffee could trigger the same wide-eyed amazement as a glimpse of a steam engine rolling into town. Meals became events in their own right, with saloons proudly advertising their new offerings on chalkboards outside. Fresh oysters tonight, pineapple pie, prime beef roast rail delivered. The change in menu also brought a change in clientele. Wealthier settlers and traveling businessmen began to see saloons as respectable places to dine, especially those that cultivated a refined image. Private dining rooms were built in some establishments, offering more privacy for meetings and negotiations. The mingling of rough cowhands with polished railroad agents created an unusual social blend. Over a shared platter of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, worlds that had once been far apart began to overlap. Yet, for all its benefits, the arrival of the railroad also created tension. Traditionalists grumbled that the old ways were better, that food from far-off places made people soft and disconnected from the land. They missed the days when every bite came from the work of local hunters and farmers, when a stew told the story of the region in which it was cooked. Some even accused the influx of fancy ingredients of ruining the honest, straightforward character of the saloon. But these voices, though loud, were drowned out by the undeniable pull of novelty. The opportunity to try foods once reserved for the wealthy or the urban elite was intoxicating. The iron rails brought not just goods, but a taste of the faraway, a reminder that even in the roughest, dustiest corners of the West, the wider world was within reach. The kitchen itself became a more dynamic place. Deliveries from the rail depot brought excitement, with cooks unpacking crates like treasure chests. The hiss of ice melting around oysters, the sweet smell of peaches escaping from their tins, the clink of glass bottles containing foreign sauces all became part of the soundtrack of the evolving saloon. In some towns, word would spread that the train had arrived with something special, and by evening, the saloon would be packed with people eager to sample the new dish. The railroads didn't erase the saloon's rough edges. Fights still broke out. Poker games still ended in curses and slammed fists, but they did give these frontier hubs a new layer of complexity. A man could still drink bad whiskey and eat beans straight from a pot if that was his preference, but he could also, if the mood struck him, pair a plate of oysters with a glass of chilled beer brought in from St. Louis. This merging of the familiar and the exotic became one of the defining features of the post-railroad saloon, a symbol of the West in transition. It was still wild, but it was also learning to savor the finer things not as a rejection of its past, but as an acknowledgement that even in a land built on grit and survival, there was room for pleasure. The coming of the railroad didn't just fill saloon kitchens with new and exotic goods. It rewrote the economics of the entire frontier dining trade. Before the iron rails, a saloon's supply lines were short, unreliable, and deeply tied to the rhythms of local life. A bad hunting season meant less meat on the menu. A failed crop meant bread made with coarser, sometimes bitter grains. Saloon owners bartered directly with local farmers, ranchers, and trappers, often paying in whiskey or credit rather than cash. But the railroad cut through those old ties like a steel blade through rope. Now, goods arrived in bulk from distant markets, purchased in larger quantities at lower cost per unit. A saloon in a mining town could sign a standing order with a Chicago meatpacking company and receive regular shipments of beef and pork, bypassing the local butcher entirely. The ripple effects of this shift were immediate. Local suppliers found themselves under pressure to lower prices or improve quality, a challenge many could not meet. Some adapted by specializing offering truly fresh game or dairy products the railroads couldn't bring quickly enough, but others simply went out of business. The saloon keeper, once a neighborly figure embedded in the local economy, began to take on a more businesslike, competitive role. With the ability to choose from multiple distant suppliers, he could play them against one another for better rates or seek exclusive rights to certain goods. In some towns, certain saloons became famous for serving a dish no competitor could match: a particular cut of beef from a renowned Midwestern ranch, or a brand of pickled herring brought in from the East Coast. These exclusives became as much a part of the saloon's identity as its whiskey or card games, and this competition bred innovation. Menus became tools of marketing, each new shipment an opportunity to advertise something no other establishment could offer. First in the territory to serve fresh pineapple might be chalked up on a board outside, or only saloon in town with Philadelphia ice cream. The novelty brought customers through the doors, but it also raised expectations. Patrons who once considered beans and bread a fine supper began to demand variety, freshness, and quality. Saloon owners had to walk a fine line between catering to these new tastes and keeping prices within reach of their core clientele, the cowhands, miners, and railroad workers, who still made up much of their business. The railroad's influence didn't end at the kitchen door. It extended to the bar as well. Imported wines, brandies, and European beers began to appear alongside the traditional rye whiskey and rotgut gin. Bottled sodas, a novelty in much of the West, became popular among younger patrons and those avoiding alcohol. This expansion of the drink menu often required investment in storage icehouses for beer, locked cabinets for high-value liquors, and that too changed the saloon's economics. The initial outlay could be steep, but the profit margins on these specialty items were often far higher than on basic fare. The supply chain itself became a more formal, almost industrial process. Freight schedules dictated when certain foods could be offered. Missed trains could mean rewriting the day's menu. In some cases, saloon keepers hired clerks or assistants solely to manage orders, track inventory, and ensure that the most profitable goods were always in stock. This was a far cry from the days when a saloon owner might ride out himself to buy a side of beef or a sack of flour. The reliability of the railroad also encouraged the development of multi-location saloon businesses. An enterprising owner could establish saloons in several towns along the line, using the same supply contracts and branding to create a consistent dining and drinking experience across hundreds of miles. Patrons traveling by train might even seek out these familiar establishments, knowing they could expect the same oyster stew or beef roast they had enjoyed in another town. But with greater opportunity came greater risk. A bad season in a distant supplier's region could ripple all the way to the frontier, raising prices or cutting off certain items entirely. A dock strike on the East Coast could mean no imported wines for months. Saloon keepers learned quickly to diversify their supply lines, maintaining relationships with multiple providers, and sometimes keeping a foot in both the local and distant markets. The new economy also shifted the social role of the saloon. Where once it had been a rough and ready gathering place for locals, it now became a point of contact with the wider world. Businessmen might stop in to sample a regional specialty they had read about in a Chicago newspaper. Railroad officials dined alongside prospectors, their conversations weaving together local concerns and national ambitions. The saloon became not just a place to eat and drink, but a place where the frontier met the modern market economy head-on. Yet for all the sophistication the railroad brought, the heart of the saloon remained the same. It was a place where men and sometimes women came to escape the grind of daily life, to share a meal, a drink, and a moment of camaraderie. If the beans were now served with a side of fresh greens, or the whiskey poured alongside imported beer, so much the better. The Wild West was still wild, but it was learning to trade in both grit and refinement. And the iron rails ensured that even in the farthest outposts, the menu could speak with a voice far larger than the town itself. With the iron rails now threading their way across the plains, deserts, and mountains, the food served in Wild West saloons became more than a means of filling one's stomach. It became a statement, a visible measure of status and connection to the wider world. Before the railroads, a man might measure his standing in town by the size of his ranch, the number of cattle he branded, or the amount of gold dust in his pouch. But now, stepping into a saloon and ordering a dish made with ingredients that had crossed half a continent became its own kind of boast. Fresh oysters, brought on ice from coastal waters thousands of miles away, were not just food, they were trophies. Edible proof that you could afford to eat like the elites of San Francisco or New York, even while standing in a dusty town surrounded by sagebrush. A plate of fine cheeses from the East, a slice of pineapple from Hawaii, or a steaming cup of imported coffee became a declaration. I am connected. I am successful. I am part of something larger than this frontier. Saloon owners quickly recognized this hunger for more than nourishment. Menus were rewritten to highlight not just what was served, but where it came from. A steak might be listed as Chicago prime beef, a pie as Maine blueberry. Sometimes the origin was exaggerated or outright invented, but the effect was the same. The name alone conjured prestige. Patrons began to speak of dishes the way others spoke of fine horses or rare firearms. Did you try the New Orleans gumbo at Murphy's? Could carry the same weight as gossip about a land deal or a poker win. These imported goods changed the rhythm of social interaction in the saloon. It was no longer enough to simply buy a round of drinks to show generosity. Now, a man might order a platter of oysters for the table, or a bottle of French champagne to celebrate a mining strike. The performance of consumption became as important as the act itself. A miner who spent months in the hills might ride into town with a pouch full of gold dust and make a point of ordering the most expensive dish on the menu, not because he craved it, but because everyone in the room would see him do it. The food itself became part of the theater of the saloon. Saloon keepers leaned into this spectacle. Some began offering presentation dishes, meals designed to be carried through the room on large trays, so that other patrons could watch, smell, and covet what they saw. A sizzling steak arriving at one table might spark 3 more orders before the evening was out. Tall, layered cakes with elaborate icing were displayed under glass domes at the bar, both as a temptation and as a subtle reminder of the saloon's access to refined goods. For wealthier patrons, private dining rooms or curtain booths allowed for even greater displays of exclusivity. In these spaces, the food could be served on fine china, the cutlery polished to a mirror shine, the wine poured from crystal decanters. Such trappings would have been impossible without the steady supply lines of the railroad, and they elevated the saloon from a mere public house to something closer to a club where business deals could be made over a meal that silently communicated wealth and influence. But this shift also widened the social divide within the saloon. Not everyone could afford the luxury imports. For many working-class patrons, these high-status dishes were tantalizing but out of reach, creating a quiet undercurrent of envy or resentment. Some saloons responded by offering split menus, one page for the basics, hearty and cheap, and another for the specialties. Others used the expensive items as loss leaders, drawing in wealthy clients whose presence alone lent prestige to the establishment. This blending of classes in the same room, eating very different meals, gave the saloon a new dynamic. A cowboy chewing on a plate of beans might glance over at a banker enjoying lobster and feel both admiration and irritation. Meanwhile, the banker might relish being observed, the sight of his meal reinforcing his place in the town's hierarchy. Food became a subtle language, one that could include or exclude, flatter or insult. The railroad's influence also encouraged a kind of culinary one-upmanship between saloons. If one establishment began offering imported olives or caviar, its rivals would scramble to match or surpass it. Some even staged menu wars, where each week brought a new headline item designed to outshine the competition: a whole roast pig, a barrel of oysters, a shipment of candied fruit. Newspapers sometimes joined in the game, publishing glowing descriptions of a saloon's latest acquisition, turning it into a matter of civic pride. All of this meant that a saloon's reputation now rested not just on its liquor, entertainment, or the friendliness of its staff, but on its ability to maintain a steady flow of prestige goods. The public came to expect that certain establishments would always have something rare and remarkable on hand. A failure to deliver could tarnish a saloon's image, making it seem old-fashioned or poorly connected. And so, the saloon keeper became not only a host and businessman, but a curator of experiences, constantly searching for the next item that would make his patrons' eyes widen. In time, this culture of conspicuous dining helped weave the saloon into the larger fabric of American consumerism. The frontier, once defined by scarcity and improvisation, now had pockets of abundance, where a man could eat like royalty if he had the means. The railroad had collapsed the distance between the dusty main street and the glittering cities of the coasts, and the saloon was the stage upon which this new connection played out in full view. The smell of fresh-baked pie or the clink of fine glassware was as much a part of that transformation as the whistle of the arriving train. In the end, the food in these Wild West saloons became more than a meal. It was a performance, a currency of status, and a symbol of the frontier's slow but steady entanglement with the modern world. Behind the swinging doors and the clink of glasses, beyond the music of the piano and the low murmur of voices, there was another sound in a Wild West saloon: the hiss of hot iron, the crackle of fat-meeting fire, the dull thud of cleaver on chopping block. The kitchen was its own world, part battlefield, part theater, where men and women worked in a choreography dictated by the demands of the crowd and the limitations of the frontier. The arrival of the railroads had expanded the pantry beyond recognition, but it hadn't changed the fundamental truth: a saloon's reputation could rise or fall on the skill of its cook. In many cases, the head cook was as much a character as the bartender, a man with a stained apron and a booming voice, or a quiet woman whose dishes could silence a rowdy table with the first bite. They were alchemists of scarcity, able to take a side of beef tough as saddle leather and, through hours of slow cooking, turn it into something tender enough to cut with a fork. The heart of the kitchen was the cast iron stove, massive and temperamental, fed with wood or coal. Its surface was crowded with skillets and pots, its oven door opening and closing like the shutter of a camera as pies and roasts went in and out. The air was thick with a blend of aromas roasting meat, onions sizzling in lard, bread rising in the heat, and the faint tang of coffee always brewing at the back. Even with the new ingredients brought in by train, much of the cooking still relied on frontier techniques. Smoking, salting, and pickling remained essential, not only for flavor, but for preservation. A barrel of salted pork or a crock of pickled eggs could keep a saloon running through a supply gap, and the best cooks knew how to dress up these humble staples so they tasted like something worth paying for. Imported spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves were used sparingly, each pinch a reminder of the long journey from distant ports. Meat dominated the menu, but the methods varied widely. A thick-cut steak might be seared hard in a cast-iron pan and served with a pat of herbed butter melting over the top. Pork ribs could be slow-braised in a sauce made from molasses and whiskey, the meat falling off the bone in sweet, smoky strands. Game was common too: rabbit, venison, even wild turkey, often stewed with root vegetables until the flavors blended into a rich, earthy whole. The imported luxuries took pride of place when they arrived. Oysters, for instance, might be served raw on chipped ice for those who wanted to taste the sea, or fried in cornmeal for a more filling dish. Lobster tails were split and broiled with a dusting of paprika, a spice rare enough to make patrons raise their eyebrows. Exotic fruits were sliced into bright arrangements, their colors a startling contrast to the brown and beige tones of most frontier meals. But it wasn't only the ingredients that set the saloon kitchen apart, it was the sense of performance. Dishes were sometimes prepared within sight of the patrons, a steak sizzling on an open grill where the smell could drift through the room, luring in the undecided. The clang of utensils and the rush of steam as a lid was lifted became part of the saloon's soundtrack. Even the plating was considered, with sprigs of parsley or carved vegetables, adding a touch of refinement that was almost theatrical in its intent. There was also a cultural mixing at work. The West drew settlers and workers from all over: Mexican vaqueros, Chinese railroad laborers, European immigrants, and each brought their own culinary traditions. In some kitchens, tortillas were cooked alongside biscuits, soy sauce might be splashed into a stew, and German-style sausages hung curing in the corner. This fusion created flavors that were unique to the frontier, dishes that couldn't be found anywhere else. The cooks themselves often carried stories as rich as the meals they served. Some had learned their trade in army mess halls, others in big city hotels before heading west for adventure or opportunity. A few were former prospectors or cowhands who'd turned to cooking after injuries or bad luck. Their skills were honed not just by recipes, but by the daily challenge of feeding a crowd with whatever the latest supply wagon or freight train had brought. Yet for all the showmanship and variety, there were still the quiet, unglamorous tasks that made the kitchen run: scrubbing pans blackened by the stove, grinding coffee by hand, hauling buckets of water from a pump or well. On busy nights, the kitchen could feel like a pressure cooker, every surface crowded, every pair of hands in motion. Orders were shouted through the haze of smoke and steam, and the heat could be stifling, especially in summer. But there was pride in the work, a sense that each plate leaving the kitchen was a piece of the saloon's reputation. And when a dish drew praise from the dining room, it could lift the whole crew's spirits for the night. In the end, the kitchen was both the engine and the soul of the saloon. The drinks might draw a man in, the music might make him stay, but it was the food, its smell, its taste, its comforting weight in the stomach that could turn a passing stranger into a regular. In a land where survival often meant enduring the bare minimum, a well-cooked meal was more than nourishment. It was a reminder of civilization, a taste of connection to the wider world, and sometimes a fleeting feeling of home. The dining room of a Wild West saloon was not merely a place to eat, it was a stage, and the food was part of the performance. When a pot of stew was ladled into deep bowls on an ordinary night, the air would hum with steady conversation, the clink of cutlery keeping time with the shuffle of boots on the floorboards. But on nights when the cook sent out something special, A roast turkey with crisp skin glistening in the lamplight, or a pie still warm from the oven. The mood in the room could shift as palpably as if a band had struck up a new tune. Certain dishes carried a kind of unspoken ceremony. A whole side of beef, carved at the table, was a show of abundance and success. Platters of fried chicken, piled high and fragrant with black pepper, suggested comfort and community. Even a simple loaf of fresh bread could quiet the chatter for a moment as patrons broke off hunks and passed them around, the steam rising like a promise that the night would be a good one. Special occasions brought their own menus. When a wedding was celebrated in the saloon, a not uncommon sight in towns where the saloon doubled as the largest public space, the tables would be set with whatever finery could be found. Mismatched china, linen cloths borrowed from the hotel, candles in glass bottles. The kitchen would stretch itself to the limit, producing platters of roasted game, baskets of biscuits, bowls of gravy, and trays of cakes iced with sugar imported at great cost. Whiskey and champagne flowed side by side, and toasts would punctuate the night until the music and dancing took over. Political gatherings had their own flavors. A candidate trying to win over the town might sponsor a supper-free plates of ham, beans, and cornbread, served to anyone who came to hear him speak. The cooks would work for days in advance, smoking the meat, soaking the beans, and making sure the bread was fresh and plentiful. The speeches might be long and the promises empty, but no one ever forgot a good meal, and more than one election was said to have been decided over the saloon's tables. Celebrations of fortune when a miner struck gold, or a cattle drive ended with a handsome profit, were marked by extravagance. Oysters and champagne might appear, their very presence a reminder that the world beyond the dusty streets was rich and varied. A whole pig might be roasted and served with apples, or a feast of fish brought in from a distant river on ice. These meals were not just about taste, they were about status, about showing that success could transform a man's life, if only for a night. The kitchen and the dining room worked in a kind of rhythm, each responding to the other. A cheer in the dining room could spur the cook to send out a surprise plate of sweet rolls. A particularly beautiful roast might be carried out for all to see before being carved. Patrons who lingered over dessert might find themselves drawn into conversations with strangers, the shared pleasure of a good meal lowering the usual guard of frontier life. The saloon's regular menu was built for speed and satisfaction dishes that could be made quickly in large quantities and that filled the belly after a day's hard work. But the special meals, the ones people talked about for months afterward, were slow affairs. They took time to prepare and time to enjoy, and they changed the atmosphere in the room. The rough edges softened, the noise became laughter instead of argument, and for a few hours the saloon felt less like a place of escape and more like a gathering hall. There were also quieter moments that had their own kind of ceremony. A drifter spending the last of his coins on a bowl of soup and a slice of bread might eat slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a memory. A couple at a corner table might share a plate, their conversation hushed but the bond between them clear. Even these small rituals were part of the saloon's life, woven into the larger tapestry of its role in the town. The staff understood this, even if they didn't speak of it. The bartender pouring drinks, the server carrying plates, the cook watching from the kitchen doorway, they all knew that a meal could be more than food. It could be comfort after loss, celebration after hardship, or simply a reminder that life had moments worth tasting. And so they played their parts, night after night, turning the act of eating into something that could shape the memory of a place and a time. In the West, where days could be long and uncertain, the saloon's dining room offered a kind of certainty. The food might vary, the faces might change, but the promise remained. Here, for the price of a meal, you could find warmth, company, and a taste of the life you were working toward, or the one you had left behind. In the memory of the frontier, some saloon dishes took on a life far beyond the kitchen that first made them. They became stories, treasures of taste woven into the fabric of a town's identity. In a land where most meals were functional beans to fill the stomach, bread to keep a man going, there were rare creations that seemed almost magical in how they stayed in the mind. Sometimes it was a recipe passed from hand to hand, each cook adding their own touch, but always preserving the heart of the dish. One town might be known for its steak thick cut, cooked over mesquite coals, until the outside crackled and the inside glistened red. Another might be famous for a stew, so rich and hearty that it was said to keep a man warm through the coldest night. There were pies baked with fruit hauled in on the stagecoach, their crusts flaking apart like snow, and biscuits so soft they could be torn apart with a sigh. Patrons spoke of these dishes the way others spoke of gold strikes or heroic shootouts, as if they were proof of the town's worth. Travelers would come through dusty streets and make their way straight to the saloon, drawn by a name and a promise. "You haven't lived until you've tried Old Hattie's chicken," they'd say, or "Don't leave before you taste the apple pie at the Red Lantern." And so these recipes became more than food. They were a kind of currency, a reputation that could carry a place through hard times. The cooks guarded them fiercely. Some kept their methods written in notebooks, tucked away in flour bins or hidden under floorboards. Others never wrote them down at all, insisting that only those who worked beside them in the kitchen could learn the true way. A pinch of this, a slow stir of that, the patience to wait until the scent told you it was ready. These things could not be measured, only felt. And yet, as the years passed, recipes traveled. A bartender moving to a new town might carry with him the secret of a spiced cider that could thaw the coldest night. A former dishwasher, now cooking for a railroad crew, might recreate the biscuits he'd once served to cowhands, bringing a taste of one place to another. In this way, the flavors of the frontier spread, carrying with them the ghost of the saloons where they were born. But not all dishes survived the journey. Some belonged too much to the place and the people who made them. They depended on a certain cut of meat from a local ranch, or a wild herb gathered only in the hills nearby. When those things were gone, so too was the taste, leaving only memory. And memories have their own way of seasoning the truth. Ask 3 old-timers about the best steak they ever had, and you might hear 3 different stories, each more vivid than the last. They would speak of the glow of lantern light on the table, the sound of boots on the floorboards, the moment the first bite melted on the tongue. It didn't matter if the details shifted with time. What mattered was how it made them feel, and how that feeling became part of who they were. In some towns, the saloon's signature dish became part of local celebrations. An anniversary of the town's founding might be marked by serving the same stew that had been ladled out on the first day settlers arrived. A festival might crown a pie-baking contest winner, honoring the tradition that began in the saloon's kitchen decades earlier. Children grew up knowing these flavors, associating them with home, safety, and the steady presence of community. Even as the West changed, as trains brought in new goods and restaurants competed for attention, the saloon's legacy lingered in these recipes. They were stories told in taste, and those who had once sat at the old tables could recall them with a clarity sharper than photographs. A single bite could bring back the smell of wood smoke, the murmur of voices, the weight of a mug in the hand. These dishes were proof that even in a world defined by movement, by cattle drives and wagon trains, by gold rushes and shifting borders, there were things worth staying for, if only for a night. And so, in the kitchens of the West, the work went on. Hands kneaded dough, stirred pots, and sliced meat with the same care as the cooks before them. The recipes might adapt to the times, but the soul remained, because in the end, it was never just about what was on the plate. It was about the story it told, the memory it kept alive, and the way it made a weary traveler feel, for a brief and shining moment, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. They say the Wild West was built on grit, gunpowder, and gold, but just as much of it was built on the warm, fragrant air of a saloon kitchen, the clink of forks against tin plates, and the comforting weight of a full belly after a long day on the trail. Over time, those meals stopped being just meals. They became part of the story of the West itself. The way a legendary gunfight might be retold with more drama each time, so too would a steak dinner or a bowl of chili be described with a touch more grandeur, until it wasn't just food anymore, but a symbol of survival, of camaraderie, of a life lived boldly at the edge of the known world. In the earliest days, the travelers who stepped through swinging saloon doors rarely thought about history. They thought about the dust on their boots, the ache in their backs, the coins in their pockets, and the smell of something cooking that promised to make them feel human again. But years later, when they spoke of those times to their children or grandchildren, the food became part of the legend. It wasn't just a stew, it was the richest stew a man ever tasted, with meat so tender it fell apart in the spoon, and a broth that could bring a dead man back to life. And if the truth was a little less poetic, a tough cut of beef boiled with onions and potatoes, it didn't matter. The memory had done its work. By the late 19th century, the idea of the saloon meal had seeped into the imagination of the entire country. Newspapers printed colorful accounts of frontier towns where a stranger could sit down and be served a feast worthy of a king for a single silver dollar. Traveling writers, eager to sell their stories, described saloons where the tables were piled high with roast game, cornbread still steaming from the oven, and desserts dusted with sugar brought in from far-off cities. Some of these accounts were pure invention, others exaggerated, but all of them fed into the growing mythology of the West, a place where hardship was met with generosity, and danger was balanced by the comfort of good food. As the West was won, and the frontier closed, former cowhands, miners, and railroad men began to drift eastward or settle down in quieter towns. They carried their stories with them, and the saloon meals were always there in the telling. A man might recount the time he played cards until sunrise, and somewhere in the middle of the tale, he'd pause to mention the plate of beans and bacon he'd been served hot, smoky, and perfect. Another might speak of the night a blizzard trapped half the town indoors, and the saloon keeper ladled out steaming bowls of chili to everyone who could squeeze inside, keeping them warm until morning. Even when the rest of the details faded, the food remained vivid. Then came the era of dime novels and early Western films. Writers and directors, searching for ways to make their stories feel authentic, reached for the saloon as a central image and food as a vital detail. They showed the weary hero pushing through the doors, removing his hat, and being served without a word, coffee poured, steak slapped onto a plate, a biscuit sliding across the counter. These small acts of hospitality told the audience something important. That even in a world of lawlessness, there were places where the rules of kindness still applied. As the 20th century rolled on, nostalgia began to flavor the way Americans saw the saloon. Restaurants with Old West themes sprang up in cities and towns far from the plains, serving chili in tin bowls, cornbread in cast iron, and cowboy coffee so strong it could wake the dead. It was play acting, of course, clean floors, electric lights, and menus printed on glossy paper, but it tapped into something deep, a longing for the simplicity and directness of a time when a meal could be as honest as the man who served it. The real frontier food had never been fancy. It had been practical, made from whatever could be hunted, grown, or traded for. But in memory, it became something greater, a taste of freedom, of the open road, of the belief that no matter how far you'd ridden or how much you'd endured, there was a plate and a place waiting for you at the end of the day. Historians, when they sift through letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts, find that food comes up again and again, not just as necessity, but as a source of pride. Towns boasted about their saloons cooking the way others boasted about their sheriff's aim or their preacher's sermons. Recipes were sometimes printed in the paper, partly to share and partly to stake a claim. This is ours. This is who we are. In modern times, reenactments of frontier life often include meals served as they might have been in the 1880s, and visitors discover that even something as humble as beans cooked over an open fire can feel extraordinary when you know the story behind it. And so the legend lives on not just in museums or in films, but in kitchens and dining rooms, in the clatter of dishes and the low murmur of conversation over a shared meal. The Wild West may be long gone, but in every plate of chili, every wedge of cornbread, every sip of strong black coffee served with a smile, there's a piece of it still alive, still warm, still waiting to welcome you home. When the last cattle drives had ended, When the gold and silver booms had faded into dust, and the railroads had stitched the continent from coast to coast, much of what had been the Wild West began to dissolve into memory. But the food, humble, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, refused to vanish. Recipes that had once been born out of scarcity, ingenuity, and the relentless demands of the trail began to find new life far from the dusty towns where they were first served. The cooks who had ladled chili in smoky saloon kitchens or flipped steaks over open flames carried their skills into the new century, and with them they carried a flavor of the frontier itself. At first, these dishes were kept alive in small ways by families who had once lived out west, by ranch hands who settled down and opened diners, by traveling salesmen who swapped stories over plates of familiar fare. Chili con carne, for example, had been a practical way to stretch tough cuts of meat with spices and beans. In the cities, it became something else entirely. A signature dish at fairs, competitions, and roadside cafes. Each cook adding a personal twist, more cumin here, a splash of coffee there, turning it into a dish with as many variations as there were hands to stir the pot. Cornbread, too, evolved. In the West, it had been dense, sturdy, meant to be eaten hot and fast before it cooled into a brick. In the kitchens of the South and Midwest, it became lighter, sweeter, baked in ovens rather than over coals. Yet the cast iron skillet remained, a quiet relic of the open range. And the golden crust it produced was as much about tradition as taste. Even coffee, once boiled strong enough to strip the lining from a man's stomach, was transformed. In the saloon days, it had been brewed in battered pots, grounds swirling in the cup, drunk black and hot, because there was no other way. Now, the same idea of cowboy coffee became a point of pride for campgrounds, diners, and even upscale restaurants eager to market authenticity. They would brew it over open flames for tourists, serving it in tin mugs and telling stories of cattle drives and campfires under endless skies. As these foods traveled, they changed to suit new tastes and new circumstances, but they never entirely shed their origins. In every pot of beans simmered with pork, there was an echo of a saloon cook making do with the cheapest cuts. In every plate of steak and eggs served at a roadside cafe, there was a shadow of a chuck wagon breakfast, cooked before sunrise for a crew about to ride hard all day. Over time, these echoes became part of America's culinary DNA. Cookbooks in the early 20th century began to include sections called Western Specialties or Cowboy Fare, even if the recipes bore little resemblance to their originals. The names alone, trail stew, frontier hash, miner's pie, were enough to conjure images of dusty boots and swinging saloon doors. Meanwhile, in small towns across the country, former saloon owners, or their descendants, set up restaurants that leaned heavily into their heritage. Walls were decorated with old photographs, menus written in a hand that mimicked 19th century script, and dishes presented as just like the West. Whether or not the food was truly authentic mattered less than the feeling it gave the diners. A sense that they were participating in something older, something real. And so the recipes became storytellers in their own right. A bowl of chili might come with an anecdote about a legendary outlaw who once swore it was the best he'd ever had. A slab of cornbread could be linked to a frontier bride who baked it every Sunday for the entire town. These stories, passed from cook to waiter to customer, added flavor that no spice could match. Today, historians studying the West often point out that its culinary traditions are among the most enduring legacies of that era. Unlike gunfights or gold rushes, which have been romanticized into near fiction, the food remains tangible. You can taste it. You can smell it. You can make it yourself, following a recipe that has been tweaked and polished over more than a century but still carries the bones of its origin. In some ways, the spread of these recipes mirrors the spread of the West itself, restless, adaptive, unafraid to blend with what it encounters. Just as towns sprang up along rail lines and cattle trails, so too did flavors spread along highways and rivers, carried by those who knew the comfort of a hot meal at the end of a hard day. In that way, The saloon lives on not only in history books, but in every kitchen that sets a pot to simmer and serves it with the same unspoken promise the West once offered to every weary traveler. Sit, eat, rest, and know that for this moment, you are exactly where you belong. When the last cattle drives had ended, when the gold and silver booms had faded into dust and the railroads had stitched the continent from coast to coast, much of what had been the Wild West began to dissolve into memory. But the food, humble, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, refused to vanish. Recipes that had once been born out of scarcity, ingenuity, and the relentless demands of the trail began to find new life far from the dusty towns where they were first served. The cooks who had ladled chili in smoky saloon kitchens or flipped steaks over open flames carried their skills into the new century, and with them they carried a flavor of the frontier itself. At first, these dishes were kept alive in small ways by families who had once lived out west, by ranch hands who settled down and opened diners, by traveling salesmen who swapped stories over plates of familiar fare. Chili con carne, for example, had been a practical way to stretch tough cuts of meat with spices and beans. In the cities, it became so nothing else entirely. A signature dish at fairs, competitions, and roadside cafes. Each cook adding a personal twist, more cumin here, a splash of coffee there, turning it into a dish with as many variations as there were hands to stir the pot. Cornbread, too, evolved. In the West, it had been dense, sturdy, meant to be eaten hot and fast before it cooled into a brick. In the kitchens of the South and Midwest, it became lighter, sweeter, baked in ovens rather than over coals. Yet the cast iron skillet remained, a quiet relic of the open range, and the golden crust it produced was as much about tradition as taste. Even coffee, once boiled strong enough to strip the lining from a man's stomach, was transformed. In the saloon days, it had been brewed in battered pots, grounds swirling in the cup, drunk black and hot because there was no other way. Now, the same idea of cowboy coffee became a point of pride for campgrounds, diners, and even upscale restaurants eager to market authenticity. They would brew it over open flames for tourists, serving it in tin mugs and telling stories of cattle drives and campfires under endless skies. As these foods traveled, they changed to suit new tastes and new circumstances, but they never entirely shed their origins. In every pot of beans simmered with pork, there was an echo of a saloon cook making do with the cheapest cuts. In every plate of steak and eggs served at a roadside cafe, there was a shadow of a chuckwagon breakfast, cooked before sunrise for a crew about to ride hard all day. Over time, these echoes became part of America's culinary DNA. Cookbooks in the early 20th century began to include sections called Western specialties or cowboy fare. Even if the recipes bore little resemblance to their originals, the names alone, trail stew, frontier hash, miner's pie, were enough to conjure images of dusty boots and swinging saloon doors. Meanwhile, in small towns across the country, former saloon owners or their descendants set up restaurants that leaned heavily into their heritage. Walls were decorated with old photographs, menus written in a hand that mimicked 19th century script, and dishes presented as just like the West. Whether or not the food was truly authentic mattered less than the feeling it gave the diners. A sense that they were participating in something older, something real, and so the recipes became storytellers in their own right. A bowl of chili might come with an anecdote about a legendary outlaw who once swore it was the best he'd ever had. A slab of cornbread could be linked to a frontier bride who baked it every Sunday for the entire town. These stories, passed from cook to waiter to customer, added flavor that no spice could match. Today, historians studying the West often point out that its culinary traditions are among the most enduring legacies of that era. Unlike gunfights or gold rushes, which have been romanticized into near fiction, the food remains tangible. You can taste it. You can smell it. You can make it yourself, following a recipe that has been tweaked and polished over more than a century, but still carries the bones of its origin. In some ways, the spread of these recipes mirrors the spread of the West itself, restless, adaptive, unafraid to blend with what it encounters. Just as towns sprang up along rail lines and cattle trails, so too did flavors spread along highways and rivers, carried by those who knew the comfort of a hot meal at the end of a hard day. In that way, the saloon lives on not only in history books, but in every kitchen that sets a pot to simmer and serves it with the same unspoken promise the West once offered to every weary traveler: sit, eat, rest, and know that for this moment, you are exactly where you belong.